I'm going to go ahead and read our panelists' bios, and then we're going to jump in. Jennie Dunham has been a literary agent in New York since May 1992. In August 2000, she founded Dunham Literary Inc. She represents literary fiction and nonfiction for adults and children. Her clients have had both critical and commercial success. Books she has represented have appeared on the New York Times bestseller list in adult hardcover fiction, children's books, and children's book series. Her clients have won numerous awards, including New York Times Best Illustrated Book, the Schneider Family Award, Boston Globe Horn Book Honor, and Los Angeles Times Book Prize finalist. She has been a member of the Association of Authors Representatives since 1993. She served on the program committee and was program committee director for several years. She was also a member of the electronic committee. She started her career at John Brockman Associates and then Mildred Marmer Associates. She was employed at Russell and Vulcaning for 6 years before she left to found Dunham Literary Inc. She frequently speaks at writers' conferences and events. She spoke at ours last year, and we've been thinking about how to get her back ever since. So guys, please say a thank you and a clap, clap, clap in your chat box to Jennie Dunham. Thanks for being here, Jennie. We're glad to have you. All right, this guy. A well-known literary agent at Janklow and Nesbitt Associates, Kirby Kim represents both literary and commercial authors. When it comes to literary work, he's alternatively drawn to rich, sweeping stories that try to encompass a time or a place, or tightly written, narratively innovative stories that bridge genres. His commercial interests include thriller, horror, speculative and science fiction, young adult, and middle grade. He also represents a range of nonfiction, working with leaders and journalists in the areas of science, culture, and current affairs. He's also known for representing memoir and pop culture, in particular music and comedy. And you guys got to see him for just a few minutes yesterday as our special guest when his client, Kieran Millwood Hargrave, spoke to us. So welcome, Kirby Kim. Clap, clap, clap. Guys, thanks so much for being here. And I'm going to start with just a really simple question for each of you that I think is always great to hear from agents. And that is, how the heck did you even become a literary agent? Because when you're a kid, I don't think that's the thing you dream about, right? I wanted to be a dentist. I don't know about you guys. I was dreaming big. But my mom still reminds me of that actually occasionally. So Jennie, I'm looking at your face right now, so I'm gonna let you start. How did you come to this job?
Well, sort of by accident. I mean, I always loved books when I was younger, but I didn't know that the only person I knew who was involved in creating books was an author. So I wanted to be an author, but not really. Then I found out about editors and I was like, oh, that's what I want to be. And then when I graduated from college, someone gave me a book called Author and Agent about Eudora Welty and her agent, Dermot Russell. And I read that and I was like, oh, that's a possibility too. And I got offered first by an agency and I took the job and I really enjoyed being an advocate for authors. And sort of funny full circle, I ended up working at Russell and Vulcaning. So that was Dermot Russell was one of the two founders of that agency.
Oh, I love it. I love it. So it was meant to be. Kirby Kim, what's your journey? What's your long and short of it?
Mine is, I was in law school. I didn't want to be a lawyer though. I realized that fairly quickly. And I was looking for something to use the law degree in like a different creative field. So I was looking at like non-legal career alternatives. And one of the options that I found was being a literary agent. And I think one of my favorite books was The World According to Garp, and I distinctly remember I think his name was John Wolfe, the agent for Garp and their relationship, and I remember that role, and I like the idea that there were a lot of different hats you could wear, and so I just I discovered it that way, and my main thing was I wanted to be a part of the process, and this seemed to be a wonderful part to be in. Yeah.
So sticking with you, Kirby, can you give us a sense of what just in your definition of what a literary agent does for an author. And I know there's so many answers to that question, but I guess more just starting in the bigger, like, larger look, and then we're going to dive down into the more specific ways that a literary agent works with an author.
Sure. I think, the first thing we are is like a filter, right? Is a first line of kind of discovery. So a lot of times an agent is the first person or one of the early ones to say, okay, this book, at least for books in particular, to say, I think this is a book that can be published out in the wider world. And then, we work editorially with them to get that material ready. And then we're a matchmaker, right? And I might be getting too granular. I don't know if that's
No, just, I'll cut you off.
Yeah, it's just, we're a matchmaker, we're a business advocate, right? And we just help them in general navigate kind of the world, because there's a lot to know about it, and there's a lot of shorthand. There are a lot of things that can be really disorienting because it's just a completely different industry than most people are involved in.
So then, Jennie, going to you and kind of jumping off of the different roles that Kirby just described, and one that I'm really wanting to spend some time with today is the idea of helping a writer, being a part of a writer's process in shaping their work and editing their work. I think that's sometimes the part of the job that a lot of folks don't think about or realize as much. They think, oh, an agent just goes and sells a work into the world, and that's what they do. But can you talk about that piece of it? What for you as an agent that involves?
So when I go out on submission, I like to be really confident, and that often means talking with an author about what they've written, because they don't necessarily see what I'm seeing, and I am thinking about what an editor is going to see when they read it. And so I go through several rounds of revision often, which is not traditionally part of the agent's job. The traditional role was sell the work, submit the work and solicit offers, negotiate the contract, collect and appropriately distribute royalties. But these days, they're, all agents I know of are doing editorial focusing up front. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll try to find out where the writer is stuck, or what they're not seeing, in order to get the manuscript or sample where it's supposed to be, which can mean, okay, here, go try these 5 exercises and see if one sticks and jostle something free. Or sometimes it's asking the right questions, or sometimes it's saying, here's the problem, and find a way to go fix that. It's not my job to rewrite it, but I find it very helpful, and I do that with all clients, even New York Times bestsellers.
Yeah. And just a follow-up on that. So at the very beginning of that relationship, I imagine these are conversations you're having before you even sign a client to make sure that they're amenable to editing. What are there, is there anything about that piece of the process that you can tell us about, meaning what you're expecting from a writer before you even sign them in terms of that work that you would like to be able to do?
Well, first of all, I want them to come to me when they're as polished as possible. I don't want to be doing copy editing, but I also want to get a feel for, are we on the same page about the project? I think it's really important for an agent to get what the work is and get who that artist is, because that's part of, we're not just selling a story, we're selling the author, who they are, their credentials, what they've written, what the potential is for this book, and possibly more. So what am I trying to get out of it? I'm always trying to first fix the work and have it artistically consistent with what the author wants it to be, in a way that will make it sell best when it goes to market. But I also know that the working process is very important, because whatever I'm experiencing is what I expect an editor would experience too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So Kirby, I want to come to you with this same question, meaning, can you talk about the importance of that piece of your job as well? That idea of helping an author, working with an author to shape their project to make it the best material that it possibly can be.
Yeah, I rarely find that I take something on that couldn't use some further editorial work. And I think as an agent, part of like the way I see my job is to bring some value added in that respect as well. So very often, what it comes down to is what my resources are at so that I can get this to a place it needs to be for submission. So a lot of times when I take something on, I need to be able to see my vision for it and our ability to work together, getting it to submission being in about 4 drafts or so. So like maybe like a major edit, a further kind of pruning and dealing with things, and then hopefully a polish, and then we're out the door. There's something around there, just because I have a finite amount of resources and time. And if I'm taking on a new client in particular, that's taking away from my existing clients. So I have those obligations. Rarely do I see a manuscript and I think like, it's great and there's great writing here, but we'll get there. Maybe it'll take years. And that's usually not the place I'm coming from. There's a lot of great stuff we see, and I just can't see myself there within that amount of time. So I usually have a sense of what I want to do with a manuscript when I call an author. But to be completely honest, I don't really get full clarity on very specific ideas until I read it actually a second time. So usually what happens is that I'll read it just for pleasure and to kind of assess the market and to make some general notes. And then I'll call the author, offer a representation, but I won't really give detailed notes until I read it again. And that's usually my process.
But I would imagine in that phone call, that's where you're just, as Jennie was talking about, gauging that they're up for that sort of work, that, you see that there is work to be done and that they're going to be willing to do it.
Yeah, I found that when I reach out to writers, they're hungry for direction. So a lot of times when I reach out, they want to work with someone. They want to make it better, and a lot of times they're actually fully aware of that there are some deficits in there. So I'm bringing a different perspective. I'm also bringing, Jennie and I are bringing in the perspective of the market, which is sometimes in opposition to kind of the artistic kind of expression, right? And so while you might love this digression that goes off here in this one place, we might say something like, look, like editors are actually going to probably put the book down here right when you get into that, because it doesn't advance the plot, and maybe we should actually get rid of that, or at least condense it, so we'll bring that perspective, and hopefully, what that does is it's the perfect marriage, right, for the market itself.
So, and I want to ask both of you this, and it's such a maybe tough question to answer. So it could be a big mistake, but you say that Kirby, you say that you would take on a project that might have up to 4 revisions, right? And Jennie, you mentioned that you work really closely and dive in. So I guess what I'm wondering is, because we're always saying to writers, and I would imagine you would agree with this, that you want to get that manuscript in the best shape it can be in before you query an agent. You want to get it as far as you can take it. And of course, there's going to be work that an agent can do to take it further. But how do you see something that, you realize an editor is going to stop reading right here, but you still want to offer that person representation? I guess what I'm asking is, what's that piece of it that still makes you say, yes, I would like to work with you, even though I see 4 drafts to come? Kirby? I'm looking at your face, but I also, if Jennie, you're ready to answer, you jump in.
I can start. Since I was talking about this before, briefly, I think we a lot of times we sign on promise, right? We sign on what we are naturally a first line. So, and we have our time on the line, but we don't have to reach into our pocketbooks the way that a publisher does, right? So I think in that sense, a lot of it when we sign is about potential. And so I will look at something and yeah, there are plenty of times where I just kind of, like I'll get to a place, where I just say I can't do it. The hardest submissions are the ones where they're on that fence, where you're like, they've got real talent and skill and there's some stuff, but then a number of like reservations kind of accumulate up to a certain point, and where you just say, you know what, this is actually going to require too much. But by all means, I might come to a place of 50 pages and I'll be like, well, it really sags here, but then I know that beyond it, I understand where the plot picks up, and I can see, if I can see where the issues are, then I can try to get it to a submission ready place. The issue with an editor is, right, they need it to be much more camera ready. I think, as Jennie was alluding to earlier, which is how the nature of our jobs have changed, is that the editorial acquisitions process now is informed by other people in the room, not just editors who understand where the book is going to be and where they're going to take it, but where it is right now in the moment. And that's as a result, we have to get it closer to what it looks like as a publishable manuscript.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. Jennie, how about you? Is there a way for you to kind of give us a sense of what that difference is for you, the books that you say no to and the books that, or the authors that you say, okay, I see the promise here?
So one thing for me is, I have a saying, if I'm on the fence, the answer is no, because I have to love it. So I look at who the author is and what the manuscript is. And this is maybe a little bit different than Kirby, but I won't necessarily offer to represent somebody and then do the work. I'll say, hey, I'll take a look at this again. If you'll revise it with this feedback and come back to me on an exclusive basis. And so then I get to see, are they taking the work there? Are they really getting it? And I've had the experience too, that people have really rolled up their sleeves and come back, and I'm like, wow, that was 3 rounds in one go. Yes, let's keep talking. What will make me say no? When I say here's a problem going on and we're trying to fix it, if someone goes in and does just that, it's going to have effects other places in the manuscript. And if I see they did just that and they didn't fix any of the other problems that now exist, I'm going to say, okay, you didn't get the big picture. You did what I said, but you didn't understand the spirit of what I was saying necessarily. And so someone who fixes the problem, and it doesn't have to be the way I said. I have one client who, every time I've ever said this, doesn't work here, you might consider this and this, comes back with something different that worked even better than what I suggested. But if you're not doing that and making it consistent through the whole manuscript, that's probably when I would say I'm not sure that, we're on the same page.
Yeah, I love that you two are slightly different in this respect, because I think that can be a question that writers have often when they send to an agent and the agent gives them feedback, but there's that kind of gray area of, I'm going to go do this work, but I don't know if it means I'm working with, you're not telling someone you're working with them, so they know they're not working with you, but you know what I mean? Like it's, well, wait, what happens though if I do the work? Does that mean she will sign me, or does it mean she won't sign me? And that can be kind of a weird middle place sometimes, right? But at the same time, it absolutely makes sense too that you would want to let them not only give them the suggestions, but also see if they can pull it off and if they're serious about it. Yeah, I love that. So I guess
can I add one more thing in there?
Oh, sure.
It may be that either Kirby or I give some suggestions and the author says, that's really not where I want this book to go, I don't agree. And my response to that is, okay, that's great, then maybe I'm not the right person for you. And Kirby, I suspect you would have a somewhat similar response.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Kirby.
There definitely are those times. I'm working on something now, in fact, where it's kind of like a literary thriller, and I felt like it was a little too skewed toward the literary side. And so when we had our conversation, I said kind of straight up, I think it needs more of the thriller. Like, I think that's the direction I would take it. And so we were aligned, but I could very well see another agent being like, well, I want to actually get more of that out, you know, and take, you know, that's a very binary thing.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to something that you said, Jennie, which was, I only take on projects that I love. And hearing you guys talk, and it's part of why I'm having this part of the conversation. I see a lot of questions piling up. I am going to get to your questions, but I know that I think it's important for writers to hear from two agents like yourselves, two really, you know, smart and generous and interesting folks, but to know that you could still say no, and it's because you just know you're not the right fit for that project.
Yeah.
And it's
doesn't
not
necessarily mean it's not going to sell or that it's not well written or anything like that. Just means I'm not the team member you want on your team.
Yeah. So, so somebody did ask, and I want to address this now. They say, so they do suggest fixes as well as problems on the first call to a writer. And I would assume that that is a part of your conversation when before you offer representation, is to talk about those editorial, at least, you know, an understanding of what you're seeing needs to be done before you sign somebody. Would that be correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, like, actually, sometimes there are times where I'll have something. I just had a conversation. I'm in a beauty contest on something, and I was like, look, I don't have that many specific comments. You know, here's what I suspect of the issues, but and what I want to make sure was there. But this is so clean that they're not like super obvious on the first read, for me at least.
Yeah.
So I will say, so, you know, I think that can come across, and maybe that's a red flag for him. That can be a red flag for writers, you know, who are just, they want direction right off. But I don't always have something very specific to say on the first call.
You know, go ahead.
If it's a beauty contest, you're giving feedback, and, you know, we're taking our time and expertise. And one thing that does feel sort of not great is if someone takes the comments that I've taken my time to, you know, write down and then submits to another agent or goes with another agent. I feel like there's a little bit of, I mean, then it feels like I'm being taken advantage of. So I'm willing to be in there and do the work, but I don't want to do it for somebody else to benefit from.
And that would be, and, you know, often folks do ask about exclusivity and exclusive submissions. And, you know, you mentioned that if you give extensive notes, you give someone notes, then you are asking them to resubmit to you exclusively. And that, to me, you know, makes a lot of sense. And I'm glad that you're saying that. And then would you guys agree, though, I've said to writers that if somebody does ask for exclusivity, that it is appropriate and okay to suggest that there be an end date to that exclusivity, so that they're not just waiting for you until you get back to them, that you both agree up front on 30 days or 60 days or whatever it might be. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love this question because it's, you know, it can be a brutal answer, I think, but for the books the manuscripts that you pass on, not the ones that Kirby was talking about, those really tough ones where you can't, it's hard to say no, but for you're just reading a manuscript, you ask for some pages, when do you know that it's a no? Meaning, can you read one page? Can you read 5 pages? Do you read 20 pages of everything? Where do you guys make that decision majority of the time? Jennie, I'm looking at your face, so I'm going to let you answer.
Okay. I read until I know the answer. Sometimes that's first paragraph. Sometimes that's halfway through the book. It just depends. I read until I know the answer. You know, do I feel like the book is holding up the promise of the premise? Do I feel like it's engaging? Do I keep finding myself distracted? There's not any one reason. There are a lot of reasons. But, you know, and do I feel like, okay, with just a little bit, this could get there? Or do I feel like this is flawed? And so I read until I know the answer.
Yeah. Kirby?
So I think I go more in stages, just based on the way that I request submissions. So the first thing people do when they blind query is they send us the cover letter and the first 10 pages in the body of the email. So, 9 out of 10, more than 9 out of 10 things probably I reject based on those first 10 pages. And,
Can I interrupt you? Can I ask, do you reject based on the query letter?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So if the query letter is good, then I'll move to the first page, right? And I'll just take a look. Fairly often, I'll read the first paragraph and know that it's not for me. So then if they execute a good first paragraph, then maybe I'll read the first page, and then I'll read the first 10 pages, and then I'll ask for 100 pages is usually the way it goes for me. And I like to try to ask for the same amount from each writer, because it helps me get a sense, a little bit of like pacing of a book, by just reading on the same scale for a lot of different submissions. And if I get through that 100 really quickly and I'm asking for it, then that says something to me. Whereas if I'm taking a while with that 100, something about it just isn't speaking to me, or the pacing's not there. So that's, a lot of it just goes down to just thinking of grabbing, I think, who was it? Maybe it wasn't Stephen King, but talking about the importance of like first line, first paragraph, right? And how those grab you. And for me, those are really big indicators and signals for whether this is going to work in the long term or not.
So just to have you answer a question that was specific to Janklow, Kirby, and that is, if somebody queries through that process, because I know for your agency, there is a very specific sort of template that they follow, and they don't hear anything, is that a no? Or is it just, you haven't heard anything?
That's generally a no. We put on our submissions page under the guidelines that if the agents are interested, they'll reach out to you, which is just a matter of volume, right? Is if we did send something every time, we got a query but didn't want it, then, we'd spend a good chunk of time doing that. So we just make it very clear from the beginning. It's like, welcome all submissions, but unless you hear from us, we probably won't. Now, that having been said, sometimes agents take a couple weeks to get to you. Sometimes they can take a month because they're so backlogged. I've definitely had that. I've definitely had promising things where like a month later, I just kept it in my inbox. And a month later, I was like, I can't believe I haven't gotten back to this person. This looks really good. And I'll reach out and say, are you still looking for a submission for an agent? And then the other thing I would say is that sometimes a writer will want to check in, understandably, and to make sure maybe they've got some other interest, but they still want to gauge whether or not you're interested. And I feel like a lot of writers want to know what's a respectable amount of time within which to check in. And I generally say like a month. And usually when a writer comes back to me after a month and says, hey, I just wanted to make sure that you're, if you're interested or not, or I've got some other interest, I'll usually write back and just say, just to dispel doubt, this wasn't for me.
Because that can be confusing too. I think that every agency has a different process, right? And every agent's going to have their submission material, their submission guidelines. And we tell writers, follow the submission guidelines. It's the most important number one thing, figure out how they want it. But there's that gray area. And I don't know, Jennie, if you want to share your submission guidelines, but I find the gray area can be, you send a query letter with nothing attached because they just want query letters. And you don't hear back, there is that assumption of no. But if you're actually sharing materials when you query and you do have other people who are reading, what you're saying, Kirby, it sounds like, is that even if they've only queried you, but they do suddenly have interest from someone who is also reading 10 pages like you're reading, that they should reach out to you and say, just FYI? Is that what you're saying?
Oh, to me, no, that's not what I mean necessarily. Just, getting requests for to see pages is, I think, different from what I'm saying. I'm just saying that, like, you're a writer and you sent it out to 10 agencies and you've heard from 5, but you haven't heard from the other 5. Now, a month goes by and you still haven't heard from those 5. The assumption is that they're not interested. But if you come back to me at least and want to confirm that, I will confirm, even though generally, generally, I won't reach out if I'm not interested.
Okay. Okay. I just wanted to clarify and make sure that you don't suddenly start getting questions from a lot of people about queries. Jennie, what are your guidelines?
So I ask for a query letter in the first 5 pages in the body of the email. Excuse me. And I try to respond to all queries, although this slows me down a lot. I have my assistant respond to most of them. We receive thousands and thousands. You just can't imagine how many. And most of my query letter reading I do on my free time, not during my business day, which is another thing. But I would say this: if you've got an offer of representation, you can let us know. But if you just sent a query letter and you've been offered, we're not down I'll probably say no, just because I don't have the time to drop everything and read that at that point. If I have requested more of your manuscript, that's different. Then let me know and give me a few days to read and respond. And I might say, great that you found somebody. I'm not going to put my hat in the ring. Or I might say, hey, I'd like to talk to you and tell you what I could do for you.
Yeah. So I do want to answer one of the questions that we had. I'll answer it. Is the agent selling to a publishing house, and that's where the editors are? Yes. So editors are in the publishing house. Agents are selling to those editors. And actually, the next question is, then is the author assigned to an editor? The agent is actually submitting directly to a particular editor, and that's the editor that they are going to sell the book to. And then if all goes well, that's the editor who will continue to work with the author through the process. So I do want to answer some of these questions. These are such difficult times between the pandemic and our reckoning with the nation's deep-seated racism. It's hard to know if we as writers should even think about writing or querying without keeping these things in mind. So many of us didn't write novels that connect directly to these issues, but we also don't want to seem tone deaf by querying if agents aren't still looking with a long range lens. How are you approaching your slush piles right now? So could you, either of you, both of you, just, the world is upside down, topsy-turvy. And I think that it is a really interesting question, especially when you think about the pandemic and novels that are coming out that are set in 2020, but probably do not look like the 2020 we know of. How are you thinking about today when it comes to your slush pile? Kirby, I'm looking at your face.
I don't know if it's changed that much in terms of how I evaluate what I'm looking at, to be frank. I think I'm always looking for certain things, and in general, I'm not trying to respond too much to trends or what's happening right now too much, with fiction in particular, because books publish, from the time I sign something on and a book publishes, it's 2 years, right? Something like that. So I think one of the things that I'm always looking for, though, is urgency and kind of larger relevance, and that might be in conversation with the particular moment we're in, or it might not, but it doesn't necessarily have to tie into what we're dealing with right now by any means.
Okay. And Jennie,
writing is a really reflective process and a quiet, calm process, and I feel like most people need more time to process what's going on. I don't think people right now, in the middle of living the pandemic, want to read about, fiction set in the pandemic. They might want more nonfiction about science, etc., related to it possibly, but I think that it's something that people will want to read about afterwards more. So I'm not jumping to sign something on just because it's set in the pandemic. The other problem is a much longer, deep-seated problem in America, and I'm not necessarily rushing to sign up fiction about that now, but it's a good time to be thinking about how to come away from this and what important statements a story can make about it.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I'm still reading, like Kirby said, all the things I read before that are not even related to these two topics as well. Although I'm interested in them too.
Yeah. So it's kind of business as usual, it sounds like. That, I've heard from some agents that they're not looking necessarily to be pitched a project that capitalizes on this moment either. That, especially just for many, many reasons, that's not necessarily what you want to lead with in your query letter. Which I assume most writers are aware of. This is a great question, very simple to answer, I believe, but for nonfiction books, how essential is it to have the book completed before querying the agent?
Not important. I mean, I think it's different from memoir, right? Memoir is kind of a kind of fence straddler category. I've heard editors say both, in the sense that sometimes they like more memoir, sometimes they want more just concept and they want to put their stamp on it. I don't do a ton of memoir, frankly, so I'm not too versed in that. But when it comes to other kinds of nonfiction, we generally sell on proposal. I think it's really rare. One thing I will say about nonfiction, it's a little different from the conversation we were having earlier, which is that I do actually think very much about what's happening right now, and I try to respond to it. So I just sold a COVID book, and when the Juul the Juul e-cigarette case was coming out, I specifically looked for a journalist to tackle that and sold a book related to that. And when it comes to nonfiction, I rarely sign from the slush, to be completely honest. I'm generally reaching out to people specifically on a subject, and I'm helping them craft a proposal. So yeah,
that's good to know. That's great to know that it's more about, you're a little more, proactive doesn't sound like the right word, but you're looking for and putting together nonfiction projects more often than not.
Yeah, the fiction that I take on a lot of times is more passive. It's more like what shows up in my inbox. And the nonfiction, I'm like reaching out and,
So just to
Jennie, anything to add for nonfiction?
Yeah. One of the questions that came in is how important are bio and platform? And I would say that in nonfiction, an author's bio and platform are very important. They're crucial to being able to make the sale.
And that, can we discern though between nonfiction and memoir, right? Would you say memoir is more about the story itself, maybe, also the writing, the voice, or would you also talk about platform and bio for memoir?
I think, so the thing about a memoir is it's got to be personal enough to be detailed and really have the insight, but it's got to be universal enough that there's a wide audience of people who will want to read about it. And it's all about the artistic expression on this topic. So that's why like a novel, it needs to be a full manuscript in order to sell. And there can be less platform, ability to sell the book once it's out, but the person's bio, I find it helpful to have something in there that's related to the topic of the book, but equally credentials that a novelist might have are relevant there.
Yeah. So another question is about short story collections. The sort of understood, I think, word in the industry is that it's hard to sell short story collections. But then, I think this question kind of differentiates a little bit. Are short story collections particularly hard to get representation for? How do you approach when that's my laundry, when a short fiction writer approaches you what are the sorts of conversations or thoughts you have about whether or not you would represent them? Do you both represent short fiction?
Technically. Technically.
Yeah.
In my bio. Kirby, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I mean, I see, I mean, look, I have a writer who only does short fiction, right? And he said very clearly that he's not doing a novel. So I feel like I've seen people who thrive in this space and even within those limitations. I think when it comes to short story collections, it's tough. So you really gotta like love it. You've got to believe. Also, I think I have to believe pretty aggressively in that writer's like talent to just do other stuff, but also maybe even just do short stories. There's always the hope for a novel just in terms of the market and the way it responds. But I certainly have reached out to short story writers just on the basis of having read a couple of their short stories and fallen in love. So I do, but yeah, you know, a lot of times, at least for the market purposes, it has to have something pretty fresh, right? Something that we can distinguish it from the rest of the collections that are out there. And it helps to have some kind of cohesive theme or kind of common ground, that thread that runs throughout the stories, whether that's a genre element, whether that's a setting, you know. So I think about all those things in terms of whether or not I feel like this collection is something that I can sell. There are times where I want to work with a writer, but that writer wants me to sell a collection. And I will say, look, I will happily work with you, but I don't think I can actually sell this collection to a publisher. And if what you're looking for is representation for that, then understandably you would go somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. But I believe, am I right, that agents and maybe even one or either or both of you will also work to place short stories in journals or magazine, like I'm talking the New Yorker or some of the bigger profile places. I don't know if the same for smaller literary journals. Is that the case?
Yeah.
Occasionally, yeah.
Yeah. So just to clarify, one person has asked this question and I just want to make sure we've answered it clearly. Does a fiction author, oh, go ahead.
I just want to make sure though, don't submit just a short story. I'm not, to me, I mean, I'm not going to take somebody on and offer to represent them just to submit one story to the Atlantic.
Yes, of course. You're looking for the sort of bigger career down the road work, right?
Projects.
Yes. So just to clarify, does a fiction author need to have the whole manuscript written before querying or submitting to an agent? Can we just say yes?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Could you touch on a little bit social media? We talked about platform, but you know, folks here all the time. You have to be on the Twitter, you have to be on the Instagram, you have to be on the Facebook, you have to be on this. I know nonfiction is even heavier in terms of, you know, the expectation of platform, but can you speak to social media specifically? Do you have any advice to authors, fiction and nonfiction, about social media? Jennie.
So I would say go on social media to be part of a discussion going on. Someone who's out there, I'm doing this on social media is not necessarily going to get a lot of followers, but someone who is saying things about themselves, but also boosting other things or replying to other things, you know, is a good way to get involved and going with that. And I don't think it's necessary to be on every platform, but pick at least one that you're trying to do well and build a following and make it make sense to who you are as a writer. So LinkedIn, for example, is great if you do work with careers, but if you don't, it's not where the literary crowd is hanging out so much, you know? So make it really relevant to you.
Kirby, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, for me, the line will often be like, for fiction, social media is not determinative. But for nonfiction, it often is. For fiction, it just starts and ends with the manuscript. And if you have a following, then great, that's gravy. And that's not to say that social media can't be important. Perfect example of this is Kristen Arnett's book, Mostly Dead Things, which was published with a small press, Tin House, but that hit the list. And that was very social media driven, and she's very good at it. But it's fairly rare that that's what drives it. With nonfiction, that platform is a lot more important, and it's also something that publishers will ask and scrutinize a lot more closely.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you guys a question I get also occasionally, and that is for fiction, how do you feel about somebody having another editor, an outside editor, a freelance editor, work on their fiction, edit their fiction before they query an agent? Jennie, I'm going to let you answer.
Okay. I'm not going to take someone on because they have hired an editor. I think it's smart to try and be as polished as possible. I'm also not going to say no. It doesn't really, it could be helpful and that maybe I have to do less work with it. So that could be good. But if anything, I think there's someone who's thinking about the industry and making a solid project that they're submitting to me, but they're not pluses or minuses necessarily to it.
Okay. Kirby?
Yeah, I feel the same way. It's not determinative. I'm still just reading the work, and seeing how I respond to it. So
okay. No, that's good to hear.
And we might even say, okay, that's good, you got it here, but I think you need to do this to it. So that just because you've hired an editor before doesn't mean it's done. There's no more work to do.
I guess I've always just wondered if that is a turnoff to an agent because they think, am I getting an authentic look at this person's voice, or am I getting a polished version of that voice? But it sounds like for both of you, you don't think that. It doesn't give you a plus or a minus.
No, if that's part of their process, that's part of their process. I don't think an editor changes a writer's voice.
Cool. Thank you for saying that. Jennie, really quickly, can you tell us what you meant by a beauty contest?
So a beauty contest is when and it can happen both with agents and editors, is when there are multiple agents who want to sign an author. And so they each say, here's what I can do. They talk, and the author has to choose one of them. And presumably, there are a lot of high quality agents that, it's not that there's lopsided, they're all good, solid, reputable agents. And the same thing with editors. They're making a bid, and so this would maybe happen, say, in a best bid auction where they've got to go in with their best bid, and the agent is going to help the author assess the multiple bids and decide where to go.
How do you guys build or maintain relationships with editors? What does that look like? What's that part of your job? Just, not taking up too much time because we're running out of time here, but can you give us a sense of what your relationship building with editors looks like? Kirby, Kim, I'm going to start with you.
I think it starts with face-to-face meetings a lot of the time. The lunches that people hear about, there's drinks and such, and there's also going to conferences and being around editors there and having a relationship that builds from there. I like to, the strongest relationships I have are just people I have books with, and I try to go back to them and reinforce that relationship, because the stronger that is, the better the experience of publishing books subsequently is as well, I believe. For me, that's kind of how it develops for the most part.
I'm not necessarily talking to every editor every day, but when I call, it'll be, hey, how are your kids doing? What's going on? That kind of thing, where we know each other personally as well as professionally. And what I want is that when they see a project coming in for me, they're going to think, oh, yes, she has good taste. I want to read what she's sending.
Got it. How many queries do you guys get in a typical day?
I get 36,000 a year.
Do the math. Wow, that's a lot. Oh my goodness.
I
You
don't get
even
that
have,
many, but
yeah,
I
you don't
get a
even have
lot.
to answer, Kirby.
Yeah, I don't even at all. No.
So I guess I'll just say, you know, I think we've done a pretty good job of answering a lot of the questions. Some of them are a little more, you know, I think you're going to want to go to the submission guidelines if you're wondering exactly what you should submit to someone. They really should have their submission guidelines to answer those questions for you. Where do you guys, if I'm just, I assume I'm just going to go to your bio on your agency website. What's the best way for me to really understand what you're looking for?
Read a couple of our books, I'd probably say. Like for me, some of the books that I've responded to, I think there is a commonality that, you know, you can find if you read enough of somebody's list. You can't do that for everyone. That's pretty hard. So I can't help but feel like, you know, the agents you go to with your work, it's kind of a self-selecting process in a lot of ways, because you're doing research and you're looking at, all right, I love the book that I have here is already in conversation with what I love to read. And so you probably already have that commonality and connection based on that, if you do your research.
Yeah.
I think a great way to do research is look at the acknowledgement section of books that you like. And, you know, if your book is on the same topic, it might be hard to have an editor or an agent want the same thing. But if it's the writing style or the kind of story or something like that, you can approach them. And I'm always impressed if someone says, I read X book that you represented and I liked it. I hope you'll like what I'm writing.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. You two are awesome. And we are running out of time. So I'm going to just go ahead and say that we got to a lot of questions today. I hope you guys will clap, clap, clap in your chat box. And I want to say a big thank you to Kirby and to Jennie for just spending some time with us. And as soon as we possibly can, please know that the Writers League wants to get you back to Texas to hang out with us for sure. But until then, take care of yourselves, stay safe, and thanks so much. And thanks to everyone who's here. Thanks for being here, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay safe and healthy, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. All right, guys, we're gonna close